Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Mariah Mitchell Association for our lead off at our Science Speaker Series. And before we get started, I'd like to say a special thank you to all of our sponsors, Bank of America, our lead sponsor, Cisco Brewers of Nantucket, the White Elephant Hotels of Nantucket. And thank you again for joining us this evening. And I would like to graciously introduce you to our first speaker of our 2023 Science Speaker Series. It is such an honor and a pleasure to introduce you to Dan Bursch, former NASA astronaut and retired captain of the United States Navy. Dan graduated with a BSc in physics from the US Naval Academy and an MSc in engineering science from the US Naval Postgraduate School. He had 4 spaceflight missions, of which his final spaceflight was a long-duration stay aboard the International Space Station as a crew member of Expedition 4, which lasted from December 2001 to June 2002, which at the time set the record for the longest duration spaceflight for an American astronaut, a record that simultaneously was set with his crewmate, Carl Waltz. Retired Captain Bursch left NASA in 2005, and he retired from the US Navy after 26 years of service. Dan, we thank you so much for your service. And Dan retired in 2019 after serving as the National Reconnaissance Office Chair at the Naval Postgraduate School, and he currently resides in Monterey Bay, California. We thank Dan so much for kicking off our Science Speaker Series, and a gracious thank you again to all of our sponsors and all of our attendees. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Dan Bursch. Welcome.
Thank you, Janelle. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And thanks to the sponsors and the Mariah Mitchell Association. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. And what I'd like to do today is just go through, these will be some pictures of my 4th mission in space, which was a 6.5 month-long mission to the International Space Station. And what you see there is a crew patch. Before every mission, the crew designs basically an emblem or a patch of that hopefully describes what they're going to be doing during their mission in space. And this one is unique. At the very top, you see I flew with a Russian, Carl Waltz, and I flew with a Russian, Yuri Onufrienko. He's actually Ukrainian, and his name is spelled in Cyrillic letters at the top. Я говорю по-русски. It's mostly technical, and I've probably forgotten much of the language. But one thing I want to stress about is that the International Space Station is an international program. It's not just the Russians that are partners, but many other countries, including European Space Agency, are partners as well. And I think that's the most important part of this program is the international aspect of it. On the patch there, you see ISS, which stands for International Space Station. The Russians have their own acronyms. You see to the right there is it's not MKC, it's really MKS in Cyrillic letters, and that stands for Международная космическая станция, Russian for International Space Station. And again, it's you know, this international partnership is they're up there right now. There's I believe that there's 7 people in orbit right now because of the folks up there, and truly an international mission. And it's amazing to think that, you know, I mean, our relationship with the Russians is probably the worst that it has been in a long time, but we're still managing to live and work together in space. And that's what I think is the most important part of international cooperative programs such as the International Space Station. This was our crew photo taken a few years ago. I'd say, on the order of 23 years or 24 years ago. Yuri's in the middle. He was a Russian Air Force, but again, originally from Ukraine. and my crewmate Carl Waltz is there as well. And what you see, space station there is basically what it looked like when we left it. I'll have another photo there in a minute. Launching in the space shuttle, a lot of times people say, well, what's it like to launch on a rocket? The space shuttle, one thing about rockets is, in general, only about 5% of everything you see there. So the space shuttle, when it's attached to the external tank here, and the solid rocket boosters, this whole vehicle weighs about 4.5 million pounds, produces 6 million pounds of thrust. And of that, only about 5 to 10% of it is what actually makes it into space. So it requires a tremendous amount of energy to get a vehicle into orbit. There are some suborbital programs that are going on now. You've heard of many of the celebrities who have earned their astronaut wings by going above basically an altitude of about 50 nautical miles, but to achieve orbital velocity is almost an order of magnitude greater as far as the energy required. And we go from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in about 8.5 minutes. And now what I'm going to do is bring up a video of the launch itself. And this is not our launch, but a different launch, but it is very similar.
Firing chain is armed, sound suppression water system activated. T-minus 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Go for main engine start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Now, I just wanted to pause it here because on 2 of my missions, unfortunately, the engines shut down at that point, both on STS-51 and STS-68. My first 2 missions, the engines actually shut down because the computers detected a problem in the engines, and they went ahead and shut down. The first one was about 2.5 seconds before launch, and the second one less than 2 seconds. So in the Navy and in the astronaut office, it's routine that people earn their nicknames in different ways. And so NASA has many acronyms. One is main engine cutoff, or MECO, and you're supposed to have main engine cutoff, or MECO, after you're in orbit. Well, twice I had MECO on the launch pad, and it's not really a record I'm that proud of, but hopefully nobody breaks that again. But fortunately, we on those missions, we were able to, NASA was able to correct the problem with the engines. And the problem with that is that they actually have to take out the engines and put new engines in. They can't just check them while they're still on the launch pad. And it usually means rolling the whole vehicle back to the assembly building, which is a big endeavor. But let me go ahead and start the video again.
1. 0 and liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis, crest of its historic achievements in space. Roger, roll.
Pause it just for a second. Just make a note that a lot of people ask me, well, what's it like, lifting off in the space shuttle? And to me, it felt like launching off the aircraft carrier in a jet. But we just keep accelerating in the space shuttle. On the aircraft carrier, we would go from about 0 to 150 miles an hour in about 2.5 seconds. And here we just continue to accelerate, again, as I said, 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in about 8.5 minutes.
Houston is now controlling.
There is a lot of vibration inside the vehicle. You can feel that.
51.6 degree. 136 by 36 statute.
You can actually see some of that vibration on the outside of the vehicle on those shots that you see a little bit of it
the
here.
3 main engines on Atlantis have now been throttled down to 72% of rated thrust as the orbiter prepares to pass through the area of maximum dynamic pressure on the vehicle in the lower atmosphere.
So the engines actually throttle back when we go through when we're going the fastest through the thickest part of the
now
atmosphere.
beginning to throttle back up.
Atlantis, You are go and throttle up.
Go and throttle up. All three engines looking really good, back at full throttle now at liftoff. The fully fueled shuttle, boosters, and external tank weighed 4.5 million pounds. It now has burned half of that liftoff weight in propellant. 1 minute, 30 seconds into the flight, all three auxiliary power units that provide hydraulic power to the orbiter's systems in good shape, as are the fuel cells, providing electricity to all of the systems on board. Atlantis is already 19 miles in altitude, downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, 20 miles, traveling 2,500 miles per hour. Coming up on staging, the point at which the twin solid rocket boosters burn out and separate from the orbiter.
So you'll see the boosters fall off in this video, and they are recovered in the ocean. They were recovered in the ocean. And one thing I wanted to note was that one of the first times I saw a space shuttle launch, not being in the shuttle myself, but as a spectator, I remember seeing that bright light. It was almost like a star, and thinking about that, I knew at least most of the people that were on the end of that light was pretty neat. Okay, let me go back to my slides here. Okay, so we talked about launch, and the thing about once you get to orbit, everything floats. Like you're under acceleration. The most that we feel as far as acceleration is 3 Gs or 3 times the acceleration due to gravity. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you would feel like you weighed 300 pounds during launch. But once the engines turn off, or when you're supposed to have main engine cut off or MECO, everything instantly floats, which is really weird. It's like you've been transported to this different world. And a lot of people say, well, there isn't any gravity in space. Well, gravity is what is keeping us in orbit around the Earth. It's just we're going so fast. We're falling to Earth every second, but we're going so fast, we never get any closer. So there is gravity in space. In fact, it's about 80% of the actual value of gravity where we are, about 200 miles above the Earth. And we really are just kind of skimming over the surface of the Earth. That's how thin our atmosphere is. It's a very, very thin layer around the planet, because the planet's diameter is about 7,000 nautical miles, and we're only orbiting about 200 miles above. This happened to be our family photo during our mission. We're in the Russian segment. You see Yuri in the middle, and Carl and I on either side of Yuri. We're wearing our Russian space suits at this time. Anyways, it's a very comfortable environment up there. It's about 68, 70 degrees inside space station. We don't need to wear shoes. We just wear socks, and it's very, very comfortable up there. Okay, I just want to answer this question really quickly. It says, it's from Valerie Hall. It says, it looks like there's some exhaust coming out of the shuttle engines as well during liftoff. The exhaust is basically from the shuttle main engines is essentially it's water vapor. So that's the product. The fuel that the shuttle main engines uses is hydrogen and oxygen, and when they burn together, the byproduct is water vapor, basically. Now the solid rocket boosters use a different propellant and than that. The solid rocket boosters actually provide most of the thrust. They provide almost 5 million pounds of thrust to get us off the launch pad, and the shuttle main engines stick with the space shuttle for the entire mission. They're being fueled by the external tank. So there's our family photo. A lot of people look at this advent calendar and they say, oh, well, you can't be in space. That advent calendar is hanging down. And well, it's not really hanging down. We use duct tape to keep it in that position. We use a lot of duct tape and Velcro to keep things in position because otherwise everything would float around. We go around the Earth once every 90 minutes, about 45 minutes in light, 45 minutes in darkness. Every 45 minutes, we either get a sunrise or sunset. Quite honestly, I can't remember which one this is. I just love these photos because if you can see it, depending on the resolution of what you see on your system, you can see these layers of just colors that eventually goes to black as you get farther away from the Earth. I had the chance to do 2 spacewalks when I was up there. Why they call it a spacewalk, I don't know. I mean, because you're really space floating, you're not really walking out there. We use our arms to move around because our feet, unless we're going to stay in one position, there is something we can use to fix our feet to keep us in one position. But most of the time we're using our arms to float around, or to pull ourselves and maneuver around a space station. But I guess a space float wasn't cool enough for the original people did it, so they call it a spacewalk. This happens to be a Russian suit. The Russian suit works much the same as the US suit. Their suit works at a higher pressure, so if there's any scuba divers out there, you know that there is a risk of decompression sickness when you go diving, and that would be at the end. If you're going diving in the ocean, that would be the end of your dive. Our risk is at the beginning of our dive, because onboard space station, we maintain 14.7 psi, basically sea level pressure inside space station. But when we go on a spacewalk in this suit, it's about 6 psi. And in the US suit, it's just over 4 psi. So we are at risk for decompression sickness at the beginning of our spacewalk or beginning of our dive, if you will. But this happened to be a Russian spacesuit. The Russian spacesuit is also interesting is that you enter, it's basically a one-piece suit, and you enter from the rear of the suit. It opens like a clamshell, and then you get in and then you close it. Somewhat designed that you could almost do a spacewalk without having people help you put the suit on. Interesting how they designed that. Now, because it works at a higher pressure, it's harder to work in this suit. So this suit was not designed to, let's say, repair something like the Hubble Space Telescope. That's where the US suit is an advantage, because it works at about 4 psi. And for those of you asking questions, I'll go ahead and get those at the end of the presentation, if that's okay. I just want to make sure we leave enough time for questions at the end. So this is inside the Soyuz space capsule at the time. So the space shuttle took us up to the International Space Station, and then it undocked. But we still needed a way to get home if there was some other emergency on space station. So the Soyuz spacecraft was our lifeboat, if you will, when we were up there. So if we had any issue, if we lost cabin pressure, or if we had a fire or some other emergency up there, we would be able to get home and to get back into the Soyuz, and then we would land somewhere on Earth. It would all depend when we had the emergency and when we had to undock. We happened to be inside at this time because we just had to move from one docking port to another. So we just kind of moved the Soyuz spacecraft from one port to another while we were up there. We were making room for another Soyuz spacecraft that was going to come up. Not a whole lot of room in there, but since I'm only 5'4.5", I felt very comfortable in the Soyuz spacecraft. One of our favorite things that we like to do when we're up there is to look out the window and photograph the Earth. Now, this is zoomed in quite a bit. This is probably using probably a 600 millimeter lens, so it's very, very much zoomed in, even though we're up at about 200 miles. North is to the right of the photo, and if you look carefully, you can see this is the San Francisco Bay Area. Here's San Francisco right in the middle. And if you look closely, I think you can see my cursor, but along that line is the San Andreas Fault. So I usually say, don't buy real estate there. You see the entry to the San Francisco Bay right there, and then Oakland on the other side, and San Jose down in this area, and Novato and other cities to the north of San Francisco are to the right. And I'll zoom in another even more. Now this photo looks like it's black and white, but it's not. It's just the sun kind of intensity was too high for the camera, so it almost looks like a black and white photo, but it's not. But some of the things you can see here are the Golden Gate Bridge right in the middle. You can see Alcatraz just below it, and here's the Bay Bridge that goes across the bay, and then Raphael, the bridge that goes across here to the north of San Francisco. This is where I live now. This is Monterey Bay. North is kind of to the left of the photo. When I first saw this photo, I thought, oh, it must be early in the morning or late in the afternoon, because it looks like there's some fog here in the Salinas Valley. But that can be, after living here for a while, that can be any time of the day, really. So here's Monterey Bay. Some of you may have been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium before. Here's the Monterey Bay. Here's the Monterey Peninsula right there. And Santa Cruz is over there. So here's a picture in Nantucket that was taken during my mission. I think it may have been Yuri that took the photo. He is very helpful. I asked him, I told him there are certain places I wanted to get pictures of, and I can tell this is out of the Russian segment just because I see that little black dot there. There was basically an imperfection, or there was the window. From what the photo looks like, I can tell it was taken out of the Russian segment right there. But this was taken in I think it was February 28th of 2002. So basically 21 years, almost 21 years ago, this photo was taken. And speaking of Nantucket and hobbies, let me go back to Nantucket briefly. So a little bit of history of my family going to Nantucket. My parents, Dudley and Betsy Bursch, would work the summers on Nantucket during when they were in college, late 40s, early 50s. And my grandmother, my dad's mom, inherited a cottage in Sconset. It was Casa Marina cottage in Sconset. It was later sold, and then my parents then loved going back. Have always loved going back to Nantucket. And they later built in Tom Nevers, right around in this area right here. And they built in late 78. And I started going as a kid in the mid 60s when I was in grade school. And I loved going to Nantucket, all the activities that we would do. I remember buying kites from the Nantucket Kite Man. If any of you are old enough to remember the Nantucket Kite Man, when he sold kites on Nantucket, and they were made out of cloth. And I remember flying them just almost any day I could on the island. So before we flew on space station, since they knew we would be up there for a long period of time, they went ahead and they said, well, you can bring up a small package, maybe about yay big, of a hobby of anything that you want to bring with you. Well, I started weaving baskets in the mid 90s. My mom never had a lightship basket, so I decided, well, let me see what I can do. And through help from several of the weavers on the island, Dick Safranek, unfortunately he's passed away, but he helped me make that basket, as far as give me tips and tricks of how to put the hinges on and things like that. And so I got in the hobby of weaving baskets. And then when I started traveling to Russia in 1997, I started doing miniatures, and because it was just easier to bring all the materials with me. I've had help from other weavers on the island, like Nat Plank, in making miniatures, and also Kathleen Myers. And then I just, and other people, as far as all the weavers on the island, such a rich history there. And anyway, so I was able to bring up kits of these miniature baskets. So I made these almost like a nesting doll called a matrushka or matroshka in Russian, a nesting doll of these nesting baskets. And here I brought some with me, you can see. And there's a picture of me on space station looking a bit younger there, and with the baskets floating there for a period of time. I believe these baskets were on display at the Nantucket airport for a while. And here's another picture of just, it looks like a spider that it's around the mold. There you see the base and weaving the basket. It was at first, before I went up there, so I'm doing a time check here quickly. Before I went up there, I was concerned that, well, how do I soak the cane? How do I soak the cane to weave it around the basket? As it turns out, the surface tension of the fluid was just enough. So all I had to do, I didn't have to soak it in a bag or anything. All I had to do was take a little bit of water on my fingers, and you can, the surface tension of the fluid will almost seem like glue, will stick to your fingers a little bit. And that's all I had to do, is I just used a drink bag, got a little bit of water out, got it on my fingers, and then would draw it across the cane. And that was enough just to help me weave it. So, and it's when you're in on a long duration flight like that, it's kind of like a marathon compared to a sprint. So a space shuttle mission of 10, 11 days long was kind of like a sprint, where you had a week and a half to get everything done. But for a long duration flight that's going to last 6 months or more, or even a few months or more, you have to kind of pace yourself, because if you go at full throttle the whole time, psychologically, it can be difficult. And it was just nice to have a hobby up there to pass away some of the time, because we did have some free time on our own up there. Here's some, this is in the US spacesuit. So it looks a little bit different. It performs the same function or mission as the Russian spacesuit. Excuse me. However, this one works at a lower pressure, and the lower pressure allows you to be a little bit more flexible in the suit. So you have a little bit more dexterity in your fingers and your hands when you're working with things. One of the things also that we do a little bit different in the US suit is that we use a lot of tethers, and they have they basically say make before break. Before you get a tool out, you want to tether to it, because it's bad form to lose a tool in space. So we tether to it, get it off of our the other equipment that is stowed right here. And so we use these tethers all the time. Right there on my left arm, right in this photo, but left arm, there's a little checklist that we would use if we had some type of emergency while we were up there. Now, if you look closely, Carl Waltz is in there as well. And you can see his helmet lights are down here at the bottom. You see the two lights, and you see his hand and part of his foot up there. There's not a whole lot of room in the airlock, but we like to do it that way because we end up getting rid of some of the air in there, and we don't want to waste that much volume of air. So that's why they made it a little bit smaller. What we're doing here, some of you may recognize, but we're practicing two-person CPR. So we had to do a drill every week. It could be an emergency drill. This happened to be a medical emergency drill where we break out all the equipment and we make sure we just kind of remember everything to do. When we're up there, not only are we the crew that has to perform all the experiments, if somebody gets injured, we're basically the medical crew up there. Now I have no, I basically got some training to put in IVs, and but I'm by no means a emergency medical technician. But they gave us basic skills that they taught us, and here we are breaking out all the equipment and practicing CPR. I'm actually pushing off the ceiling because the way the engineers first designed it was to have the strap across your back, and you would lean over and then do the chest compressions this way. I just wanted to see if I could reach the ceiling, and I could barely reach the ceiling and push. Yuri was busy at the time taking the photo, so here's his chest height simulated with some towels wrapped up with, you guessed it, duct tape. And Carl's at the head of the patient simulating the 2-person CPR ready to give the breath. And hard to see it, but we do have a defibrillator back here. So it's to break out all the equipment, make sure we're kind of familiar where it's located if we needed to get it out in emergency. Again, this was just practice. This was just a drill. I was up in the middle of my sleep period, and happened to I had to use the restroom, and the restroom at the time was located at the other end of space station. So on my way back, I looked at the computer, I looked at the map. We have basically a map, essentially like a Google Earth map, and we looked at it, and I could tell where the orbit was going. I'd see that we'd be going over the Himalayas soon. So I decided to stay up. I always wanted to get a picture of Mount Everest. And and from this photo, I knew to kind of this region to look at this upside down V. And if I look at the, excuse me, eastern part of the V, there's Mount Everest right there. I believe I have a close-up of it. It was funny, earlier in the mission, I told Yuri, I said, Yuri, I really wanted to get a picture of Mount Everest while I'm up here. And Yuri just looked at me. He had flown one mission before, but it was a long duration mission of over 6 months. He looked at me and he said, don't worry, it will come around again. So he knew that if I waited long enough, there'd be an opportunity where not only do you have to pass over, but the weather has to be clear enough and the lighting conditions so you can take it. So we were able to take a picture of Mount Everest, which is right there. Okay, so this was a crew coming to replace us as we were Expedition 4 with their 4th expedition to the International Space Station. Expedition 5 was crewed by two Russians and Peggy Whitson, Dr. Peggy Whitson. And Dr. Peggy Whitson has more cumulative time in space than any other American astronaut. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think that it was somebody, let's say, like Scott Kelly, who spent over a year in space. But Peggy Whitson, through her many long duration missions in space, ends up currently has the record for the most cumulative time in space for any American astronaut. And this happened to be her very first mission. She was on Expedition 5. Now they're up to Expedition 68, so that dates us a little bit. I like to point out Yuri's hair in this photo. We gave him a nickname at the end of the mission. We ended up calling him Fabio just because of how long his hair was. And for some reason, he didn't want to get a haircut. Maybe it was like a Movember or something when people like to grow mustaches or something, but he just wanted to grow his hair out. He did cut our hair while we were up there. A couple of times, actually. So this is what Space Station looked like when we left it. It was kind of an emotional time for me because leaving our home, someplace that was our home, and we really never saw the outside of it. Yes, we did spacewalks, but it was like doing a spacewalk up close to it. But here was the first time we saw it as we were leaving, and the condition that we left it in. And look how very thin the atmosphere is. If you look up, look how very thin. That thin blue line is the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is very, very thin over the Earth, and gives you a appreciation of why we need to protect it. It's just this very thin shell around the planet. And this is as we're pulling away, and those are the solar rays, and there's also some other solar rays on the Russian segment as well. These other things are radiator panels that radiate heat away from space station. This is what space station essentially looks like today, minus the space shuttle. The space station is the largest structure that's ever been built in space. It may last that way for a while. And it's larger than a football field. When you go from solar array to solar array, it's larger, it can fill up a football field. And the living segments are basically these cylinders connected together that you see here. again, look how very thin the atmosphere is. And you can see visually with, this is not a wide angle lens or anything. You can visually see the curvature of the Earth when you're up there. So this is our landing. We were delayed in coming home. The weather in Florida, we were supposed to land in Florida at the end of this 6.5 month mission. And oh, by the way, our mission was extended primarily because the robot arm that's on the outside of the space shuttle, let me go back and show you that. So this robot arm that you can see kind of right in the middle there, that robot arm, a joint failed during our mission. And so the crew that was coming up had to do additional preparation and training in order to, when they came up, that they could repair the arm. And so that's why our mission was delayed. It had nothing to do with a vehicle or anything like that. It was the crew needed to do additional training to fix the robot arm before they came up. So anyways, back to landing. So my family is waiting for me in Florida. We delayed a couple of days, and then finally we were basically running out of air and food, and we had to come home. And we ended up landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. And the space shuttle used a drag chute to lessen, to help us slow down and also lessen the load. When the nose of the space shuttle comes down, the parachute would unfurl and basically lessen the load on the nose gear that you see up there. All right, so that's all I have. I'm gonna escape. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and I am going to go ahead and open it up to any questions you have. I think I'm a little bit early, but it'll give us more time to answer any of your questions. So I'm going to stop the share, and then Janelle, if you want to pick the questions, or I can just select the questions myself, however you'd like to do that.
Of course, seeing that this one came in off of the last few slides. So Carly and Luke had a few questions for you. First one being, how do astronauts eat their food packets without it coming out?
Yeah, it's a great question. The food, I should have brought a sample here, but the food comes, half the food is, much of the food is freeze dried, so we have to add water to it and we heat it up. Some of the food comes in cans. And so we like to eat food that, remember I talked about the surface tension of a fluid? We like to eat food that has a fluid in it because the fluid actually keeps it in the package. So if it's a really dry food, like I remember on my first mission, our pilot, Bill Reedy, brought up a bag of Teddy Grahams, and it was all dry. And when he opened the bag, it got all over the place. So when you don't have liquid to kind of keep the food in there, it can get all over the place. And just like at home, if you make a mess, you have to clean it up yourself. So, but that is why a lot of times we don't bring bread up, because bread can get dry and crumbly. So we prefer food that has some type of liquid in it, and the liquid helps keep it in the package till we're ready to get it out.
Thank you. I couldn't imagine having to clean up that mess in space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Luke also asked, how do astronauts go to the bathroom?
Yeah, I usually like to answer this question very carefully. So our bathroom, and I'll get as not too graphic in this, but our bathroom basically sounds, our toilet sounds like a vacuum cleaner. So when we use water to flush here on Earth, because the water will basically, gravity pulls it down and takes it to wherever it needs to go in the sewer system, et cetera. In space, we have to use some type of suction, and it sounds like a vacuum cleaner. So when we urinate, it's basically a tube. We all have our own personal little funnel that we use. They actually have a different one designed for females and males. We use that, and then our toilet seat we sit on. Now it's not uncomfortable. It doesn't suck on our butt or anything like that. But it has vents underneath the seat, and that just creates an airflow to put all our basically put our poop into a can, and it's saved in that can and later thrown away. So the toilets in space are pretty complicated. And if the toilet breaks while we're up there, we stop everything and we fix the toilet, because you have to do everything up there to maintain your health and well-being that we do here on Earth. It's a very common question. Thank you.
And that was from Luke. He's 8 years old. And his third question was, and I would say that this was from the view of the ISS. How far was that from the moon?
Gosh, the moon, gosh, I need to do I think it's on the order of, is it 245,000 miles away? I need to look at it, but that's very, very far from the moon. The moon takes about, I think Apollo missions, it took about 3 days to get there. So the moon is much farther away than we are.
Okay. And Nancy asked, did you have any health after effects at the end of the 6-month period in space?
Another good question. Yes. So there's two main things that affect our health up in space. The weightlessness, we have a tendency to lose bone mass. So I lost about 10% of my bone density, mainly in my hip area, while I was up in space. Astronauts lose anywhere from 1 to 2.5%, 1 to 2%. Is that right? No, about 1 to 2.5, 1 to 2% of their bone density every month that they're up there. And that's because essentially we're bedridden. If you think of it, we're floating, we're not stressing, we're not using our major muscles. And it's not the microgravity that affects the bones directly. What it affects is that our large muscle groups around our legs basically get weaker. And when they attach to where they attach to the bone, the bone says, well, you're getting weaker, I don't need to stay that strong. So it's really an effect of the muscle mass reducing and you getting weaker. Excuse me, your muscles get weaker, that causes the bone to get weaker where it attaches. So I did lose significant bone density. And so I was essentially osteopenic when I came home, and it took about 6 months to recover all that bone. The other effect that is always a concern is we're exposed to high energy particles when we're in space. The Earth's magnetic field protects most of us on the Earth from these high energy particles, and a lot of people just call it radiation, a general term. And so the Earth's magnetic field protects us. However, we're flying through that magnetic field, and we are exposed to high amounts of it. And it is a concern for a long trip to Mars that we would be exposed to that. But even with that, I'm only at 5% of my lifetime limit, says OSHA. So.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a 2-part question from an anonymous attendee. What is the spray that you see below the engines just before ignition? And
okay.
I can go right to number 2. I can pause and have you answer that.
Yeah, I'll answer the first one. So that is basically it's a sound suppression system that, because of all the shock waves that come out of the engines at start, they could basically break up the whole launch pad if we didn't have a way to, and the shock waves would come down, hit the bottom of the launch pad, and then come back up and damage the vehicle. So they call it a sound suppression system. And it's basically to protect the vehicle during launch, because the engines ignite, and then for a few seconds they're burning, they're burning shortly before you're ready to go. So they don't want that to damage the spacecraft before they go up.
And the second part of that question was, how does the shuttle roll after launch? Does it use engine gimbaling or shuttle's flight controls?
Right, it uses the engines. Good question. They use the engines that gimbal. So the engines gimbal is very subtle, but the engines gibble, and that's what allows the space shuttle to roll. And all that, incidentally, is done by the computer. The first 90 seconds of a space shuttle flight, the crew could not take over command as far as flying the space shuttle. It was the computers that ran everything. And that's because as you get faster and faster, the surfaces of a space shuttle were doing all these minor motions to actually relieve stress on the wings. And there's something that we couldn't do, or the pilots could not do to control that. So the computer basically was in control for the first 90 seconds of launch. Thank you.
Awesome. So it's an automated process.
Right.
Okay. How often, this is from Jeremy, do you exercise in space?
Yeah, so they gave us an hour to an hour and a half every day to exercise. I'm a runner, so I like doing more of an aerobic exercise. But the exercise I should have done more. Now, Peggy Whitson was much better at doing her exercise when she went in space, because I think she did very well. And I think if I heard it correctly, she may have lost very little, if any, bone density on her 6-month mission, because she did everything she was supposed to. And it's mainly the resistive exercise. And so that's what we need to do to combat the weightlessness, to keep our muscles strong. Peggy Whitson did much better than I did. I just enjoyed the running and cycling more than I did the resistive type exercises. And so we basically used something similar to, it was almost like bungee cords, using bungee cords, resistive type exercise. And that was very important. It's going to be very important for a long mission to Mars too.
Sandal asks, is the communication with NASA very clear in its reception? And do you have to be tuned in or listening to NASA quite often in any given day?
So we have almost constant communications, and it's not directly to the ground. It's usually through a communication satellite that's thousands of miles above the Earth. And consequently, there is a delay, usually of about 2 seconds. So you'll say something and you have to wait until they hear what you said, and then wait for a response. It was almost constant. I would say we almost constantly had communication with mission control, and it was pretty clear. It was very easy to understand, and it was very clear. We also could use part of that communication system to contact family and friends when we were up there. And I had to remember that 2-second delay, because many times I would call, when I was up there, I would call family and friends, and they would hang up on me because they thought I was a telemarketer because they heard the long delay. And but I learned to start talking before they even answered, so they wouldn't hang up on me.
We have a question from Regina. What advice would you give to young people who might dream of one day becoming an astronaut?
I would say do the very best you can in school. I mean, NASA does highly value, at least still to this day for the astronaut program, they highly value education. They value more of a technical degree. As far as the medical community, I think they've said before that if you're going to be in the medical profession, they want you to be a doctor. I think there's especially in the future, there's going to be jobs for everybody in space, no matter what you do. But if that's your goal, I would focus on some type of technical degree, whether it's math, science, or engineering. And currently, NASA wants you to also have a graduate degree. So after 4 years of college, it'd be another year to 3 years, depending upon what type of degree you get. And just as far as the physical wise, the biggest, I would take care of your eyes, because there is, I think they do accept, now they do, when I applied, they did not accept the eye correction that you can get as far as eye surgery to correct vision. But now they do up to about 8 diopters. So If you take care of your eyes, and you could always get that type of corrective eye surgery. Now, you don't have to be a pilot to be an astronaut. You don't have to be in the military to be an astronaut. You don't have to be a guy to be an astronaut. As you probably well know, about half of the last class of astronauts selected were female. So it's just do your very best in school and pursue some type of technical or science degree. That would be my advice. And keep trying. I started in 1984 and wasn't accepted till 1990. So they had to say no to me a few times before they accepted.
So all of that mixed with a little perseverance and grit as well.
Exactly. Yep.
Awesome. We have 2 questions from Robert.
Okay.
He asked, why did you get involved in space life and why not something else? What was it that attracted you to space? And also, what would you have done if you had not become an astronaut? And I can repeat any part of that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it's a great question. Everybody, when I talk to other astronauts, you can do this it's a good question to ask anybody, any adult, anybody or there could be any kids who already know what they think they want to do in the future, is ask a lot of questions. And so I didn't really think about becoming an astronaut. The first kind of clue I remember, I was at a summer camp when we first landed on the moon, and we listened to the moon landing on radio. It was a tough summer camp, no TV. And I remember thinking, boy, that'd be really cool to do one day, and didn't think about it again until after I was out of college. I happened to go to the Naval Academy. I went into the military. And again, it was because I talked to some, it was a friend of my dad's who had been to the Naval Academy, and he talked to me about going to the Naval Academy. I listened to a bunch of sea stories of driving ships and being at sea, and I ended up flying as far as a navigator. I'm not a pilot. I was a navigator in the Navy. My specialty was what they call flight test engineering. So I learned how to test and evaluate things. And so while I was at the Naval Test Pilot School, that's when I first found out that people with similar backgrounds had become astronauts. So it was one of those things where I asked a little bit more and said, well, how did you do it? And what did you do? And I started applying, and I didn't make it the first couple of times. Most astronauts are not selected on the first time that they apply. So Janelle said, perseverance is just if you think this is what you want to do, keep at it, because many times the first answer will be no. And then, these days, I guess I would say I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. I really like fixing things. Today, I'm almost finished replacing the engine in a truck. And so I did that today. I like fixing things. I like making things. So what would I have done had I not become an astronaut? I don't know. I probably would have stayed in the Navy probably, and maybe gone on to either command a squadron or do some other things, but I don't know. Life is a journey. And I think as long as you make good choices and don't make some bad choices that kind of derail you, now you're always a chance to get back on track, but keep making good choices. And I guess I was lucky enough to persevere, and if I could do it all over again, who knows what I would do? I don't know. Maybe pick something different.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Robert's second question was, what did you do to pass the time? Also, is there a required caloric intake every day?
Yeah, so to pass the time, we were busy pretty much from, I would say, we normally got up and we ran by Greenwich Mean Time, right? You say, what time zone were you in? Well, we were in all the time zones, and we ran by Greenwich Mean Time, and we would get up at 6 a.m. and we'd take a couple hours to review procedures. We'd have breakfast. We would wash up a little bit. Incidentally, we don't have a shower. We took a sponge bath. That was one thing I really wanted to do when I came home, was to take a real shower on Earth. So we would take a sponge bath, and then we would kind of work through the day till probably almost 6 at night. So we pretty much had 12-hour days. That kept us pretty busy. And then the remaining time, we normally went to bed about 10 at night. So the remaining 4 hours of the day, we would usually spend either writing letters home, or I would spend it weaving, if I had some time, weave baskets. A lot of times I just did on the weekends. We did Saturday, it was a half day, and kind of we would clean space station inside. Yes, we have to clean our rooms even on space station. And then Sunday was a lot of time off, and usually that's what I did. I would read books. I would weave baskets, and the baskets for me were just a way to relax and and it did help pass the time. Although when you look out the window and see the beautiful Earth, you don't want time to go by. But we did miss our family, and we did want to get back to them. And did I miss part of the question? Let's see. That was passing the time.
And the required caloric intake.
Oh, caloric intake. Yep. So we did have food specialists that met with us, and they had a menu, and I think it was on the order of something like 2,500 or 3,000 calories a day. They did have a specific foods that we would eat. Now, we did have some leeway that we could actually trade food with other crew members if we didn't feel like that, and we would do that. But they did have pretty much a menu set out for us every day, and it was pretty similar to on Earth, the same caloric intake.
And rounding out our final questions, Maya asks, how old was the oldest person in space, if you know?
Gosh, I think it was John Glenn when he flew, and I think he was 70 something when he flew. I think that was it. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think as far as orbiting the Earth now, I think that record may have probably been broken with the suborbital flights that other companies have been doing.
Did you have to sleep tethered or strapped to a bed? From Michael.
Yeah, so Michael, we actually used sleeping bags, and they were very thin sleeping bags because it was very comfortable temperature. So we had very thin sleeping bags, and we would have to strap that sleeping bag to either a ceiling or a wall. It's kind of cool in space. You can sleep like a bat. You can hang from where, and now we don't really hang. You're floating the whole time. So, but we would sleep inside that sleeping bag. And it was difficult for me on space station. It took me about 30 days before I could sleep more than about 5 hours at night continuously. I just had a little bit of lower back pain, and I'm kind of a light sleeper. And sometimes they say, well, we had straps on the sleeping bag that we could pull our knees up and put the straps over our knees. But after about 2 minutes, it just felt like I had straps over my knees. So it wasn't that comfortable anyway. But it does take a while. But what's beautiful about the human body is that it adapts very well. It's almost like we were made to fly in space. Provided we get, the food and the air and the water that we need to survive, humans do okay in space.
To lead off of that, if you could go back to space, would you?
Yes, I would. I mean, I would go in a heartbeat. I mean, I would, if they said, hey, we need an older guy, to fly, I'd raise my hand, I'm ready. Now my family might have something to say about that, but fortunately, hopefully it wouldn't take. So before my space station mission, I spent about 3 years preparing for that. And half of that time I was away from home, much of it in Russia, training to use their system. So hopefully it wouldn't be that much time away from home before I do that, but I would go in a heartbeat. Space it's a lot of fun, but however, you still miss your family all the time, but it's a great adventure.
How would you say your naval career prepped you for your time in ISS?
I think it was interesting that as far as a long duration mission, certainly the time away from your family is similar to what tens of thousands of people in the military experience every day. As I'm talking now, there are people trying to land on aircraft carriers on the other side of the ocean in rough seas and rough weather, and they're away from their families and the crews on all the ships, and whoever is deployed, they're away from their families. In that way, it was similar. So it kind of prepped me to be able to how to deal with being away from my loved ones for a long period of time. And the best thing you do is stay in contact the best you can, whether it's writing letters or we could use a phone. We could call home. We used IP phone when we were on space station. So maintaining contact, some type of contact with your family. So it prepared me in some way for that. But what it didn't prepare me for was the kind of the isolation, even though it was only 3 of us flying together in the same can. So that ended up being pretty stressful in a way. And I don't know how to relate that to, I mean, people who've had been to college and had roommates before, and you have arguments with your roommates and things like that. That happened in space too. I mean, it's just human nature when you're in, that type of psychological challenge when you're up there. So somewhat prepared, the Navy prepared me for that. But anyways, I think anybody can become an astronaut. You don't have to be in the military. I think it's challenging. I think the people who I think would enjoy it the most who would be those who like doing a lot of different things. And you also have to know how to be happy with if you're by yourself or somewhat isolated with only a few other crew members.
Okay, thank you. And Michael asked, what was your main area of study or research on the International Space Station?
So we all kind of separated. My main areas I was in charge of, we were growing brassica wheat when we were up there. So I was in charge of pollinating the flowers. We had a little bee's butt that I would use to actually pollinate the flowers when we were up there. And so we did produce some seeds from the brassica wheat. Other experiments we had, some were, there were experiments in what they call protein crystal growth. And these were more experiments that I just made sure the filters were clean and made sure they had power and they were doing well. The ventilation was okay with those. Some of the experiments, we were the test subjects. We had this one experiment actually applied shocks. It was looking at something called the Hoffman reflex. It was applying shocks to my leg. And I think the scientists have a sense of humor because the box that I would hook up to that applied the shocks, it had an acronym for its name, and it was HRTU, or hurt you. So I thought the scientists had pretty good sense of humor when they developed that experiment. And what they found is that, excuse me, so the connection between your brain and muscle movement, sorry, loses my voice. It's like the first day of school for teachers. Anyways, they did find changes in Hoffman reflex is how the brain communicates to your muscles and moves muscles. And they've noticed changes even within the first day of being in weightlessness.
And our final question to round off the evening discussion, Regina asks, what are your thoughts on the commercialization of human spaceflight? Is it good, bad? Is it necessary?
I think it's great. It's to me, the analog or what is similar is in the early days of aviation, in the early 1900s, it was only the military and it was only the very rich who were flying at the time. Well, beginning the military and then finally maybe the very rich would be flying. And I think we're in a similar period right now to where it's gradually moving to where other people have the opportunity to fly in space. I highly recommend it to anybody. The Earth is so beautiful from space, from such a high altitude. And I really think it's exciting. When they say commercialization of space, I think it's opening up many opportunities for many people to experience this, and eventually for us to find some other planet to live on, because eventually, the Earth won't be here forever. Now we're talking, don't worry, kids, we're talking millions of years in the future, right? Earth is going to be here hopefully for a long time. But if we needed to, for any reason, eventually, I think the human species would be able to survive on some other solar system somewhere there. And hopefully we'll find life out there, and also that they're friendly.
And I just wanted, we had one more question come in.
Okay.
It's a quick one. We'll take this as the last question.
Okay.
Was there a good camaraderie with the others from around the world?
Yeah, that's, it's as different, we all come from different backgrounds, and even within the United States, we all come from different backgrounds, how we grew up, what parents we had, what communities we lived in. And it's around the world. The Russians, I must say, their language is difficult to learn, not as difficult as probably some other languages. And they are culturally, they're different in many ways. But one of the things that I found that we shared in common is that the Russians cared about their kids' future. When I was in Russia training, the first day of school, the bands would come out. It was a big event that the bands would come out, and it was like a parade of people going to school, and they cared about their kids' future. And the camaraderie is anytime that you share such any type of stressful or even enjoyable experience, it just brings people together. And I just have to say that, I have tried to contact my crewmate Yuri Onufrienko, and unfortunately, I don't think he was at liberty to tell me what he thinks, because he's originally from Ukraine, of what he thinks about the war in Ukraine. I think there's a lot of people that are against it. I think there's a lot of fear that they don't want to speak up against it. But the camaraderie that we share, you leave the politics and you leave everything else behind, and we did. The people that I'm closest to are probably the people that I went to the Naval Academy with, and people that I've flown in space with, like Carl Waltz. But thank you, Janelle, and thank you for the sponsors. And looking forward to my next trip back to Nantucket in the near future, and to Mariah Mitchell.
We're excited to see you soon. And I just want to thank you again, Dan, for taking time to just share your experiences with us here on Nantucket and across the world. And just heartfelt gratitude and a million thanks again for your service.
You bet. Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And that concludes our Science Speaker Series event for this evening. And again, thank you to all of our generous sponsors that make this event possible. And with that, I bid you all a great evening. Thank you.